Nintendo may be planning on releasing a new, much faster Switch. Let's talk about it. Before that, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss another video. So recently there was an article posted over on the website Bloomberg, and there will be links in the description so you can go ahead and read the whole thing. And supposedly in this article, some Nintendo insiders talked to Bloomberg and spilled the beans on some plans for a new Nintendo Switch, which will be arriving in 2021. So let's go ahead and talk about a few of the things that were mentioned in the article, and then we'll discuss whether or not this could be true and what it all means. So there are three statements in this article I found particularly interesting, and the first one is where Bloomberg says, quote, Nintendo Corporation plans to debut an upgraded model of its Switch console next year, along with a lineup of new games, people familiar with the matter said. They go on to say, the specifications of the new machine have yet to be finalized, though the Kyoto-based company has been looking into including more computing power and 4K high-definition graphics. People briefed on the strategy told Bloomberg News, asked not to be identified because it's private. The last thing that I thought was really interesting that was mentioned in the article was, quote, the release of the upgraded Switch would be coupled with or followed by a slew of games from Nintendo itself and related outside studios, the people said. So the thing I found most interesting in this article is the fact that they mentioned including more computing power and targeting 4K graphics. Now, when they're talking about 4K graphics, I'm assuming that they're talking about a 4K display output and maybe even rendering games in 4K. And now, I know you're going to say, 4K gaming on a little handheld console like that, there's no way that could possibly happen. However, I believe it is possible, and here's why. So the Nintendo Switch runs on the NVIDIA Tegra X1 processor, which at this point is really dated. It's based on the dated Maxwell architecture that's about to be 3 generations old. Now, since then, in 2016, the Tegra X2 processor was released, and Nintendo has yet to adopt this, though, you know, it really wasn't a huge upgrade over the Tegra X1. It was based on a slightly newer architecture, and it could clock a little bit higher. And then after that, in 2018, we had the Xavier Tegra type of chip, and this was based on the Volta architecture. It had double the shaders. However, there's likely to be yet another Tegra chip coming out soon. There haven't been any specifications released or anything like that, but with the plans from NVIDIA to buy ARM, which have been circulating as a rumor around the internet, we can only assume that another Tegra chip will be coming, especially since NVIDIA still wants to produce these types of chips for their own devices as well as self-driving cars. And even if Nintendo just uses the Xavier processor, which is currently available from NVIDIA, well, that should be more than powerful enough to produce much higher resolution images, as not only does it have double the amount of GPU cores, but they're running at a higher clock speed, and it has tensor cores, which should be capable of using an AI algorithm to digitally reconstruct a much higher resolution image from a lower resolution one. But if NVIDIA does end up making, say, a Tegra X3 or Tegra X4 processor, what I would expect out of this processor is that it would be based on either the Ampere or Turing architecture. It would be produced on either a TSMC 7nm node or a Samsung 8nm node. Either way, a big improvement over the current Xavier 12nm stuff, and an even bigger improvement over the 16nm chip currently inside the Switch. And I would expect this to have the same amount of shaders as the Xavier processor, which is currently out 512, and these 512 shaders would probably be able to operate at up to 1.5 gigahertz, as this has already been achieved in the Tegra X2 processor, so I see no reason why they can't do that or even beyond with a superior node. And of course, much like the Xavier processor, it will have tensor cores, likely 64 of them, and this is going to be a huge deal because it should allow them to do some sort of DLSS or deep learn super sampling, and this should be able to run at the same 15-watt TDP. So all of those specs are interesting, but why does this matter? Well, if we go ahead and we take the Switch's original Tegra X1 processor and we do the math, well, you take 256 shaders times 2 times 1 gigahertz, divide by 1,000,000, and that gives you 0.512 teraflops of computing power. Now, if we take what I believe to be the specs of an upcoming Tegra X4 processor, which, by the way, isn't out right now, and we don't know if it even will exist, but I really do believe this is what it's going to be. Well, then you would take 512 shaders times 2 times a 1.5 gigahertz clock speed at least, and you divide that by a million. Well, that gives you 1.536 teraflops. However, we shouldn't stop there, because moving all the way from the Maxwell architecture to, say, an Ampere or Turing architecture, well, there's going to be a pretty significant increase in IPC, or instructions per clock. So if we take 30%, which we don't know for sure what the IPC increase would be, but I'd say 30% is a safe bet, and we take that 30% and we times it by the 1.536 teraflops that we just calculated for the supposed Tegra X4 processor that's likely to be in the Switch 2, well, that gives you 1.9968 teraflops, or essentially 2 teraflops. And if you take that number and you divide it by what we calculated to be roughly the amount of teraflops available in the Switch, well, that gives you a processor that's almost exactly 4 times faster. And what do you know? 4K is 4 times the resolution of 1080p. So not only would it be possible in terms of raw performance, but we're not accounting for the fact that DLSS is almost certainly going to be in the next Switch. So if you can't quite run 4K on the Switch, even on a TV while docked, well, then you could go ahead and run maybe 1080p or 1440p and use DLSS to try and upscale it and make it look really close to native 4K. So yeah, I think that the next Switch will easily be capable of running at the very least 1440p games on a TV, and the most demanding games at the very least at 1080p. And you know what? You could probably get some of those later games to actually run natively at 4K. I don't see why not. But hey, that's just what I think. What do you think the specs of the upcoming Switch that's supposedly launching in 2021 will be? I'd love to see what you have to say in the comments below, and of course, I'll see you in the next video. If you made it to the end of the video, be sure to drop a like. Every time you do so, Nvidia and Intel drop prices. Also, if you want to see more, click here. You won't be disappointed.